Welcome in. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Simplify Piano Live, where we are going to be talking about the benefits of scales today. And scales are a very hot topic. I frequently get questions about scales, whether or not people should practice scales, how often they should practice scales, how much they should practice scales. And I thought it would be good to do a live stream so that we could tackle all of these questions, and also so that I could spend a good chunk of time showing you how to practice scales and how to utilize the proper piano technique so that scales are a benefit in your practice. Because scales are one of those things that if you're practicing them incorrectly, they can actually really negatively affect your piano technique. And they can negatively affect your piano practice to the point that it becomes a little bit of a waste of time. So I wanted to clear up some questions and spend some time showing you exactly what to do so that when you practice your scales, you know you're doing it correctly. Or if you haven't started practicing scales yet, then you know how to go about it the correct way. So we're going to talk about some of the benefits of scales and why they can be useful for your piano practice and for your progress overall. And then I'm going to actually take you through 3 levels of practicing scales. And when I say levels, I separated them by beginner, intermediate, and advanced. But it doesn't necessarily mean that if you're an advanced player, you should do the advanced level of scales. I've kind of leveled these scale routines within themselves. So if you've never practiced scales, you're going to want to start with the beginning scale routine, even if you're many years into your piano practice. You're also going to want to make sure that you're doing all the things at each of the levels before you advance to the next level, because oftentimes I encounter people who have been practicing scales, and I would say 95% of the time, if they've been going about working on scales on their own, then there are elements that need to be tweaked. Things that they might not know they're doing wrong or that they're doing incorrectly that can be negatively impacting their scale practice. So we're going to cover all of it so that by the end of this live stream, you're going to have a really clear idea of what to do when you practice scales and how to practice them correctly so that they can impact your piano progress in a positive way. So before we jump in, go ahead and let me know in the chat who's here. Say hello. It would be great to know who's watching and where you're from, if you're a player, if you're a teacher. And go ahead and let me know if you practice scales. Is this something that you are regularly doing, or is this something that you don't do? For the teachers here, let me know if you work on scales with your students. I would love to see who's around. And we will dive in. So on this slide, I've listed a couple things that scales are good for, and these are my favorite reasons, but this is by no means a comprehensive list because scales can really benefit a ton of aspects of piano playing. And one of the coolest things about scales is that they can really help tie together a bunch of different concepts. And when we spend time in the right way on our scales, it really helps us tie together information. It helps us learn proper technique. And eventually, scales can be a really great way to actually practice elements of technique that we want to apply to our overall piano playing. So a couple of the reasons that scales can be really positive in your piano practice if you are doing them correctly are, first of all, because they help you with pattern recognition. When you see a professional open up a really complex score to play, we are not looking at individual notes or individual symbols. We are recognizing a lot of patterns very quickly. And scales are a musical pattern that is very, very common, that shows up in fragments and fully in lots of different pieces of music all the time. So practicing your scales can help you become so familiar with these patterns that when you see them in a piece of music, you recognize them. And also you have a context of how to play them already, which fingers to use, what technique you're going to utilize. And so it can be so much easier when you come across them in music. Hello, LTB from Portland, Oregon, or thereabouts. Not practicing scales lately. Okay, well, maybe you'll start after today. Another reason that scales can be really good is because they help you with your musical facility. So moving around the piano, they can help you with your keyboard geography, with being comfortable and confident playing all over the piano, especially if you might be in the first few years of piano study and you haven't branched out to pieces that are putting you all over the piano. Then scales can help you do that. And they help you get comfortable and confident just moving around. If we spend all of our time practicing, the notes right in front of us, it can feel really awkward and uncomfortable to branch out of that range. And scales can help us with that. Scales can help us with music theory. They help us memorize key signatures. If we start to do some of the partner exercises that often go along with scales, like chord progressions and arpeggios, then we start to recognize even more patterns and we start to understand even more music theory concepts. And I don't spend a ton of time talking about music theory here on the channel, but music theory is so helpful because it helps us get things into our cognitive memory. It helps us understand things on a much deeper level than if we ignore music theory. And so scales can be a tool that can help us understand theory concepts. And then lastly, scales are incredibly helpful for piano technique. Now, in the beginning, it takes a lot of focus to really make sure you're playing scales with the proper technique required to play scales. But once you get that down and you get more comfortable with scales, you can actually use scales as a way to practice more complex technical concepts. And scales can kind of be like your playground or, your exercise that you use to work on those concepts. So the way that scales improve our technique is actually many-fold because it affects your piano technique, your ability to play quickly, your ability to play smoothly, and then eventually you can add a bunch of other stuff on that as well. And we'll talk about that a little bit later in the live stream. So go ahead and let me know in the chat, what is a benefit that you have experienced in your practice from scales, if you've practiced scales before. Let me know in the chat if you're here live, or let me know in the comments if you're watching the replay. I would love to know what a benefit is that you've had from practicing scales. So I'm going to take some examples from this book, which is why I'm putting it up right here. This is my favorite scale book. It's the most comprehensive scale book that you will probably ever see. And it's a scale book that if you buy it, it'll last you forever because there is more on every single page than you could probably ever need as far as scale practice goes. I'll show you some examples from inside the book later, but for every single key, there's 2 entire pages, and it has the scales, it has contrary motion scales, it has all the triads, the cadences, the arpeggios, the dominant 7th arpeggios. So there's a lot of information packed into a little book that isn't very expensive. And so if you don't have a scale resource and you're wanting to work on scales in your practice, I would highly recommend this book, and I'm going to take you through these routines. And as we go through the routines, I'll show you which parts of the page to practice because when you open this book, it's a little overwhelming. There's a lot of information there, but it's not meant to be done, first page to the end. And you're not meant to go through every single line on every single page in order necessarily. So you can kind of take what you want from it. All right, let's see. When I was practicing scales, recognizing the key signatures and their sharps and flats has helped you sight read better. Absolutely. Yeah, really memorizing the key signatures and locking in what they are, not only being able to say what the key signatures are, but then knowing what they feel like and sound like on the piano. That's a huge benefit of scales for sure. If anyone else wants to chat in, go ahead. What is one benefit that you've experienced of practicing scales if you've done it so far? All right, so we're going to start with our beginner scale routine. And like I said, if you missed it, when I say beginner, I don't mean you're a beginner piano player necessarily. What I mean is this is the first stage of scale practice. So even if you've been working on scales for a while, I want you to make sure you're doing all of these things before you move on to more complex topics when it comes to scales. This doesn't necessarily mean you're a beginner piano player. So guidelines for all scale practice, but especially in these beginner stages, some things to keep in mind as you go into practicing scales are that scale practice should really last a few minutes of each practice session. You don't need to be practicing scales for 15 or 20 minutes. I would say at the very most, 5 minutes, especially if scales are new to you. And this is because when we first start to learn a complex musical subject like scales, it can be a little bit overwhelming. And oftentimes there's so many things to think about that if we go beyond that 5-minute mark, that's when we start to be less effective with what we're doing. It's harder to pay attention. It's harder to be mindful of like our posture and all of that. And it just usually starts to go downhill. So 5 minutes, if you can focus and really pay attention during those 5 minutes, that's all you need for your scales. You can make sure that you're effective that entire time, and that will build, you can build on that later. We never want to sacrifice accuracy for speed. So there's like a common misconception that when we practice scales, we should just sit down and like fly up and down the keyboard. And yes, you see professionals doing this, and maybe people that have been practicing scales for a really long time are doing this, but this is not generally what happens in the first couple years of scale study. It takes a little bit of time to get there. And so when we are first setting out to learn scales, and throughout the rest of your scale studies, you want to make sure that you are focusing on accuracy. Because if you focus on accuracy, the speed will be the natural byproduct. I talk about that all the time. That concept applies with everything in piano. And you want to make sure that you are focusing on accuracy in your scales, and the speed will come. Okay, so I'm seeing that someone lost the video of me talking. They can hear me and can't see me. Is anyone else experiencing that? If so, let me know in the chat so that I can make adjustments or fix that if that's an issue. So sorry, Connie, that you were experiencing that. With our scales, we want to make sure that we are always thinking about musicality, right? Because anytime you're practicing a technical exercise, anytime you sit down at the piano, we want to be musical. That's ultimately our goal. And so even in these beginning stages, when you're first going about studying scales, you want to make sure that you are being musical. We want to play with an even tone quality and an even tempo. And this is tricky because when we play scales, we know that we're going to be crossing under with our thumb. We know we're going to be using all of our fingers. And the crossing under and crossing over is a really common spot where people have notes that are kind of slamming out or notes that are all of a sudden a lot quieter. And that's just because, the natural state of our hands is that some fingers are going to be stronger and heavier than others. So we want to make sure that every time we play scales, we're focusing on that even sound, and it often takes a slow speed to accomplish that in the beginning. Okay, other people can see and hear. So Connie, I'm so sorry, I'm not sure what's going on, but I hope you get the video back. Okay, we want to make sure that we check our posture when we are practicing scales, and that we check in with our alignment of how we're playing the scales. So I'm just going to show you really quickly. And even if you're an advanced player, even if you're a teacher, even if you've been doing this a long time, this is still a worthwhile endeavor, because even when advanced students or advanced players come to me and they play things for me the first time, I will often notice within like the first 15 or 20 seconds, like 2 to 5 adjustments that they could make in their posture that would instantly help them sound better and instantly help things feel easier to play. So even if you've been at this for a long time and you've been playing for years, I want you to check in with your posture every single time you're about to practice your scales, and that'll ensure that no bad habits develop and that you are in fact sitting correctly in a way that's going to serve you when you're practicing your scales. So you want to make sure that you're sitting up nice and tall, and you can all practice this with me right now if you want, even if you're not sitting at your piano. You want to sit up nice and tall, and the second that I usually start talking about posture, people start to kind of like tense up and raise their shoulders, and we don't want that. So you can take a deep breath and lower your shoulders. Make sure you can imagine like a thread coming out of your head. You're sitting up nice and tall. You're sitting on the edge of your bench. And I'm not on a bench right now, I'm on a chair. But you're sitting on the edge of it. And this allows for some flexibility and movement so we can lean to the right and lean to the left and go up and down the keys, as opposed to being really far back on our bench and being kind of stuck in this position. So we're on the edge of our bench. We're at the proper distance from the keys. We're making sure that our arms are parallel to our torso. We're not like this with our arms out straight. And we're not too close where we're like right here on the keys. So our arms are parallel to our torso. We want to make sure that our elbows have some flexibility so that we can move around the keys like this. So my elbows, are leaving my torso and then coming back. And ultimately, and this is a big one, this is a huge mistake that I see very often, we want to make sure that our fingers are not up here in the keys. Okay, we want to be on the edge as much as possible. And this gets really hard, especially when we're practicing scales that have sharps and flats in them, but it's so important because if any of those things that I just mentioned are off, even by a couple of inches, it's going to result in tension. And when we have tension in our bodies, when we try to play anything, but especially when we try to play scales, it's going to result in uneven sound. It's going to result in difficulty moving up and down the piano, and it can lead to pain. It can lead to injury, all negative stuff. We want to avoid all of that. So even if you're advanced, check in with your posture before you start and make sure that your fingers are on the edge of the keys. The other thing we want to make sure is that we have our fingers nice and rounded. And what I like to think about is the fact that the keyboard is in a horizontal line, right? And I'm going to actually go back to this other slide because I have a picture of a keyboard here. On the right-hand side of the slide, you can see there's a picture of a keyboard. It's a straight line. And in this case, it's up and down. But when we put our hand out like this, our fingers are not making a straight line. They make this kind of U shape, this sideways U shape. And the second that I round my fingers to proper hand position, look at that. Now my fingers are in a straight line. And that is conducive to playing every single note on the piano, at the same point in the key on the edge of the keys. So if you have those fingers in that rounded position, you're going to have no problem producing an even tone quality and playing on the edge of the keys. If your fingers are flat or you're up in the keys, it's going to be a lot harder. All right, we want to get comfortable and be aware of any discomfort because like I mentioned, once we start talking about posture and I start saying play on the edge of the keys, round your fingers, sit up nice and tall, then people just tense up and it all can go downhill. So do it slowly and give yourself a few minutes to check in with these different parts of yourself and make sure that as you are implementing correct posture and correct hand position, that you're continuously breathing. And that you're checking in with the various points. And when you're focusing on playing on the edge of the keys, your shoulders aren't accidentally rising to your ears. Just make sure that you're always checking in and being aware. In the beginning, it can feel really difficult and awkward, but it gets so much easier as you go on. All right, so when you're first starting to practice scales, your goal is to get one octave, hands alone. So you can practice the right hand by itself and you can practice the left hand by itself. And I'm going to show you an example of what that would look like on a piece of music. So here's the C major scale with my right hand. I'm starting on C, I'm going up one octave, I'm coming back down. I'm doing the same thing with the left hand. And I'm doing that separately, right? Just each hand on its own. That ensures that I'm not focusing on too much at once. And I have time to think about what I'm doing. And I have space in my brain to do all of the checking in with the posture that we were just talking about. When you're practicing a one octave scale, especially if scales are new to you, or you feel like maybe you've practiced scales but you didn't give them the attention that they need, say the finger numbers out loud. Saying the finger numbers out loud is one of the best ways to ensure that you will learn and pay attention to the proper fingering of scales. And fingering with scales is one of the most important things. Because if we fly by the seat of our pants and make up the fingering with scales, you're not going to retain the patterns that you're learning. Okay? And part of the benefit of learning scales is there's a set fingering for all of the scales. And that means that whenever you encounter parts of those scales in your music, you have a context and you already actually have the knowledge of what fingers to use because it's in your muscle memory and you can draw upon your knowledge of scales. But if you don't take the time when you're practicing your scales to memorize that fingering and to make sure that you're doing it correctly, your scale practice won't go well. But two, you're missing out on a huge opportunity to have scales benefit your actual pieces of music. All right, I'm going to check the chat for a second. Let's see. When I'm doing multiple scales, I sometimes lose track of the fingering. Yes, single scales are not that bad. That's so true. And I'm gonna give you a big, huge tip that's gonna help you with that when I talk about putting scales hands together here in a couple of minutes. Something that can really solve that problem for you. We want to make sure that we are, when we're doing the crossing over and under, that we're minimizing the movement. So one of the common errors that I'll see with scales is that when people are practicing and their thumb is going to cross under or their third finger is going to cross over, we see this. They'll kind of like lift their elbow up and twist their body to get their thumb under. But really, when my thumb is going to cross under, it's a very small motion. My thumb is just sliding across the keys and tucking itself under that third finger, and it doesn't need to be a big, huge motion. So we want to make sure when we're doing those crossover and unders that we're making that motion as small as possible. This is going to facilitate speed and evenness later on. Like I mentioned, you can talk out loud. Say the note names. If you want to help internalize what the key signature is, say the note names out loud while you play. If you want to help yourself memorize the finger numbers, say the finger numbers out loud while you play. So helpful and can really make the difference between remembering what you did during your scale practice and not remembering. And then, like I said before, accuracy. We always want to focus on accuracy. Now, this is a lot, right? I mean, this is the beginner stage of practicing scales, and this is all the things you need to think about. And so you can see why it's important to go slow and to start with one octave and to give yourself the time and the space. I recommend no more than 5 minutes in each practice session and give yourself a few weeks. It usually takes adults like 2 to 4 weeks to really feel like these one octave scales are done accurately, evenly, with an actual internalized knowledge of the correct finger numbers, with an evenness of tone, and with the proper posture. So it's not something that we need to do quick. It doesn't need to be fast progress. It needs to be the correct progress. And if you focus on these things and you give yourself the time and the space to accomplish it, you can do it. It's just going to have to happen in little baby steps. Now, once you have these things, then we want to make sure that we are keeping our speed nice and even. So we can apply the metronome and we can start to play one note per click with the metronome and make sure that our tempo is even. If you've been focusing on accuracy, you'll find that the speed will naturally start to come. Once you've completed step 1 and you are doing all of those things from the previous slide accurately, the speed will naturally come. You can then work towards getting this one octave scale hands together. Oh, I have speed on here twice. Well, and then the speed will come with hands together eventually. And then you can work on adding more octaves. You can work on increasing the tempo of the metronome. And then you can branch out and start to learn other scales. C major, G major, D major, A major, and E major. E major have the same fingering. And so once you memorize the fingering for C major, you can then transfer that to different key signatures and work on that same fingering. And I recommend practicing them in a group like that because that's going to help you really solidify that fingering before you have to memorize any other fingerings. Now, someone mentioned something about hands together. And, even when it's a one octave scale and we're trying to put things hands together, it can be tricky because the hands are not crossing over and under at the same time. So it's a lot to think about all at the same time. So I have 2 practice suggestions for that. And if you do these practice suggestions, you can definitely get success playing things hands together accurately. And so the first practice suggestion is to utilize the Post-it method. And if you've been on the channel a long time, you have probably heard me talk about the Post-it method. I'll give you a quick replay of the Post-it method right now, and then I'll link in the description to a video that describes it in a little bit more detail. But the Post-it method is essentially where we get an actual Post-it and we cover up all of the notes except for 2. So with scales, I would start with 2 notes. And you take those first 2 notes of your scale, hands together, and you play them. And you make sure that you have all of the things that we talked about. You're breathing, you're in alignment, your posture is good, you're playing on the edge of the keys. And you do that 5 or 6 times until it feels easy. Then you take your Post-it and you move it 1 note. And then you play the first 3 notes of the scale. And you play those 3 notes until you can do all of the things that we talked about and it feels easy. And then you take the Post-it and you move it 1 more note. And it sounds so tedious. And in a way, it is. but it actually goes pretty quickly, especially if you're just doing a 1 octave scale, and it forces you to focus on very, very small sections of music, which means you have the capacity in your brain to make sure that you're doing it accurately. And when we do those 3 notes 5 or 6 times accurately in a row, and then we do 4 notes 5 or 6 times accurately in a row, and then 5 notes 5 or 6 times accurately, you're not going to forget it. It's going to be so ingrained in your muscle memory because you're doing it the same way over and over and over again. So that's my first tip for getting scales hands together. And then my next tip is to actually narrate out loud when the crossing under and over is happening. And I should have included a slide with a visual of this, but I did not today. But you'll find that like when you're doing hands together and you're going up, your right hand will cross under the 3rd finger, and then the left hand will cross with the 3rd finger over. And then your right hand will do under the 4th finger, and your left hand will do 4th finger over. And what happens is it creates this little pattern where our right hand is leading on the way up. So we're going like under 3, over 3, under 4, over 4, under 3, over 3, under 4, over 4. And then on the way down, the left hand leads, and the left hand goes under 3, and then the right hand goes over 3. The left hand goes under 4, the right hand goes over 4. And it's like this little follow the leader thing that's kind of cool. And if you can stay with your scales and actually out loud tell your hands what they are doing and when they are crossing over and under, it's a game changer. It's incredibly hard to do it, but it forces your brain to focus in a way where you will not be able to do it wrong. And if you do it wrong, you're going to notice immediately instead of getting to the end of the scale and then realizing that at some point you messed something up. So those are the 2 ways that I would practice to get things hands together. They work really, really well. All right, everybody. This is our beginner scale routine. We're gonna keep talking, and I'm gonna keep building on this, but let me know in the chat how this is all sounding to you. Is any of this new to you? Does this seem too easy for you? Let me know in the chat. I'm really curious to know who here has practiced scales, where you are in that journey, and we'll go on and we'll talk about the next level. I put a little visual in here. So this is the book that I was talking about at the beginning of the live stream, my favorite scale book. And this is just an example. I kind of mentioned that this book is so comprehensive. There's so much information in this book. And so everything that I just talked about is literally the first measure of the first line of the first page of this book. Okay? So you're just doing little sections, you know. You can start with just the scales, and then you can work to add the other patterns like the triads and the chord progressions. But it's a hugely comprehensive book. It's very helpful. All right, so our intermediate scale routine. This is when you've moved beyond all of the things that I just talked about. And those things are starting to feel easy, and you can do them, you know, with fluidity and with ease. Let's see, LTB is saying, counting the fingering out loud is new to you and using the Post-it method for this. This is great information, very, very clearly taught. You're welcome. Awesome. I'm so glad. I'm glad that it's going to be helpful for you. And if you utilize those techniques, it'll make a huge difference. Connie Jax is saying, yes, I practice scales, both major and minor. That's awesome. Very cool. So intermediate scale routine, the guidelines are similar. We want to make sure that we're just doing a few minutes in each practice session. We never want to sacrifice accuracy. We always want to be musical. These are all the same things that we talked about before. We also want to start tuning in even a little bit more to our technique here, because generally this is where speed will start to become a little easier. And that doesn't mean that we're flying up and down the keys, but we might be going at a little bit of a faster tempo than before. And that means that we need to make sure that we're really on the edge of the keys and that we're not starting to develop any habits as a result of trying to go fast. So oftentimes when we try to push the tempo, we start to do really funky things that we might not realize that we're doing. And so hopefully at this point you have that awareness of your body and of your posture and of your technique, and you're continuing to check in with that at this level. Now, this is when we can start to branch out a little bit. So before we were just focusing on one octave, hands alone and then hands together. Now we can start to branch out to 2 octaves, hands alone and then hands together. We can continue to do the same things, like make sure we're minimizing the movement with our crossing over and under, memorizing the key signatures, talking out loud, focusing on accuracy, but we've added an additional octave. So now we are at 2 octaves instead of 1 octave. Oops. And then we can start to add some of the other key signatures. So when you get into key signatures like B flat major or E flat major or a lot of the minor key signatures, we're going to start to have different fingerings. And so now at this point, you have that original fingering from those first 5 scales really down. You've memorized that fingering. It's in your muscle memory. You know that fingering. And so now you can start to branch out to some of the other keys. In our minor key signatures, we also are going to have 3 different forms of the scale that you can practice. And so you can start to learn the difference between the natural, the harmonic, and the melodic minors, and you can start to practice those scales as well. This is usually the point in the process where if I haven't already, I'll start to introduce the triads and some of the chord progressions and arpeggios. And this is something, I get asked a lot, like how much of that people should be doing. And I would say you have to use, if you're not working with a teacher, you have to use your discretion. What can fit into the 5 minutes and how much can you handle while making accuracy your ultimate goal? Accuracy is the most important thing. And so if that means that you're doing scales and just a couple of triads, great. If that means you're doing scales and arpeggios and all the chord progressions, great. It's whatever you can handle, keeping accuracy as the goal. But we eventually want to start working our way through those other patterns like the triads and the chord progressions, which are all in this book. We can start to increase the speed a little bit. That's going to happen naturally. This is one of my favorite stages of scale practice because we can start to add on other techniques to focus on. So we can start to play our scales with different dynamics. We can start to play our scales with different articulations, and this will help open a door into a lot of other technical things that we can practice. So for example, if I'm going to practice my scales staccato, I might work on the difference between a wrist staccato and a forearm staccato in my scale practice. So I might say, okay, I'm going to practice my 2 octave C major scale, and this time I'm going to focus on wrist staccato. And now I'm going to do it and I'm going to focus on forearm staccato. Hang on. And I can start to incorporate different technical aspects into my scale practice. So now, not only am I focusing on the technique required to play the scales, I'm actually using the scales as like a playground or a workshop to work on other technical concepts. And you can do the same thing with dynamics. You can practice playing your scales forte or doing an even crescendo or an even decrescendo. And this is a really great way to also make your scale practice exciting and interesting and musical so that it doesn't just feel like you are working on exercises or that you're drilling something really boring. You can create musicality by changing those dynamics and by changing the articulations. Good evening. Welcome in. I see in the chat. So at this point, you're going to be doing this whole first line in the scale book because that's our 2 octave C major scale up and down. And then you can see on the next page, I've circled the triads, and you might just add a few of them at a time, or depending on, what your level is, you can add more. And then we have the chord progressions. You can do 1 measure at a time of the chord progressions, arpeggios, and you're just kind of starting to weave other things into your practice. Just like the scales, the triads, the chord progressions, and the arpeggios are all patterns that come up very frequently in music. And so the argument for practicing them is that the more familiar you are with these patterns, the easier it is to recognize them in your sheet music so that when you open something, you're not just seeing a sea of individual notes. And also, you'll have a context for how they sound and how they feel on the piano before you even start to learn a piece of music. And that is hugely, hugely valuable. Now, this is a close-up of what that 2-octave C major scale looks like, all written out in the scale book. So you can see they have all the fingerings in there for you. Every single note is written out. And so there's nothing left up, to the imagination. There's no guessing. All right, now our more advanced routine. This is, again, not necessarily corresponding with your level at the piano, okay? Generally, by the time people get to the more advanced scale routine, they are a little more advanced in their piano playing. But this means that you've been practicing scales for a long time, and you've been able to accomplish everything that I talked about in the beginner and the intermediate scale routine. And that stuff is feeling easy to you. It's feeling like you're accurate 95% of the time or more, and it feels easy for you to be that accurate. Then you'll be ready for some of this other stuff I'm going to talk about. So same guidelines. Notice that the guidelines don't change. The philosophy of how you approach the practice does not change regardless of your level. So just a few minutes in each practice session. And at this point, you might be, 7 to 10 minutes, depending on how long your entire practice is and depending on what your goal is for scales. You might increase beyond 5 minutes, but not very much beyond 5 minutes. You're never sacrificing accuracy. You're always being musical, and you're always playing evenly with nice tone quality and a solid tempo. And at this point, you have a pretty solid understanding of the technique required for scales. Your awareness is something that you automatically do. You're checking in, making sure you're comfortable, making sure there's no tension. And hopefully at this point, that's feeling a lot easier. And that's something you don't need to be reminded of anymore. That's something you know how to do on your own. Now, at this advanced level, you can work towards 4 octaves hands together. So you can actually start a lot lower on the piano and play 4 octaves up and 4 octaves down. And my favorite way to practice scales at this level is to incorporate some rhythm. And you can do this at the beginning levels, but by this point, you're really ready for it. But I'll start and I'll have my students turn on the metronome, and let's say we'll do it at 60. And we'll start by playing 1-octave scales that are quarter notes. So the click is for every single note for 1 octave. And then when we get down to the bottom, we switch to 1/8 notes for 2 octaves. And then we switch to triplets for 3 octaves, and then 16th notes for 4 octaves. And it makes it a really cool exercise where not only are you working on everything we've previously talked about, but you're also getting a solid rhythm workout because you're having to switch between those different note values. And that helps you with your sense of rhythm. So I'm not going to do the whole exercise for you, but I'll show you the basic concept. So you start 1-octave quarter notes. And then when you're done with that, you switch to 2 octaves, 1/8 notes. And then when you do that and you come back down, you switch to triplets for 3 octaves. And then 16th notes, 4 octaves. And you can actually go beyond that. When I was in college, my teacher had me do, she would have me switch to 5s and 6s and 7s per beat as well. But even just doing, quarter notes and 1/8 notes or quarter notes and triplets can be a really great way to practice and infuse rhythm into your scale practice. At this point, you're also doing more chord progressions, more arpeggios, more inversions, and you are at a level now where you're really internalizing that information. And at any of these levels, if you're going to start doing the chords and the arpeggios, don't ever do any of this practice mindlessly. We talked about saying things out loud, like with the fingering, saying the fingering out loud, saying the notes out loud so that you memorize the key signatures and you memorize the fingering. Similarly, when you're practicing the chords, either the progressions or the triads, make sure that you're saying the chord out loud. Saying C major, D minor, E minor, saying the letter name of the chord out loud, saying what the Roman numeral of the chord. So this is the 1 chord in the key of C. This is the 2 chord in the key of C. And helping yourself to connect those dots, helping yourself to learn the music theory behind it and to really get it into your cognitive memory, because that's the way that these scales are going to be the most beneficial. Scales, chords, all of it, all of the patterns. Now, at this point, you can also use your scales to practice even more complex musical ideas, like different types of tone production and how you use the weight of your arm to achieve those different types of tone production. More advanced dynamics and articulation. So you might take something that you're doing in a piece of music. Let's say, in a piece of music, you have a phrase where there's like a crescendo that lasts for 8 notes and then a decrescendo that lasts for 8 notes, and you might actually start to do that in your scales. And crescendo for 8 notes, decrescendo for 8 notes, crescendo for 8 notes, decrescendo for 8 notes, and really start to do even more complex musical ideas in your scale practice. And then, like we already talked about, you can be adding all of the arpeggios, all of the triads, all of the chord progressions. So as you can see, this is what it looks like in the book when you start to add even more. And then, of course, you could make it your goal to get everything on the page. You can kind of endlessly practice this stuff as long as you're doing it with a purpose and with a reason. Because the biggest mistake I see is setting out with the best of intentions to practice scales, to practice chord progressions, to practice arpeggios, but then going about it in the wrong way. So it ends up wasting your time and not benefiting you in your pieces or in your journey to musicality. And worst case scenario is it actually hinders your journey, your musical journey, because if you're doing it wrong, it can lead to injury. You can develop really bad habits that will ultimately make things worse, and we want to avoid that for sure. All right, so we have time for questions. So if anybody has scale questions, scales are one of the things that I get asked questions about the most. So go ahead and type them in the comments. I would love to take a couple minutes and answer your questions if you have them. It can be about scales, arpeggios, chords, triads, any of that stuff. Go ahead and type those in the chat and I will answer questions. And while you're doing that, I'll share this slideshow in my Facebook group. So if you want to download it and you want to print out any of those slides and have them on your piano for your practice, you're welcome to do that. I would encourage you to do that so that you really can remember all of this and make sure that you're doing it in your practice. I also hosted last week a Simplify Success Piano Challenge in the Facebook group that was incredible. It was so much fun. We met every single day for about 10 to 15 minutes, and I asked people to pick one measure of their piece, and I showed everybody exactly how to really break things down and focus on rhythm, and then something else, and then something else, and then something else. And by the end of this week, people were posting videos where they were playing their measures pretty flawlessly and feeling success after every single day of practice. And I left that challenge up in the Facebook group. It's pinned to the top of the group. So if anyone is interested in following along with that, it's going to live there for at least a few more weeks. And then I'm planning on doing another challenge in November. So go ahead and join that group if any of that sounds interesting. Let's see. So LTB says, not a question at the moment, but a comment. It sounds so doable that only 5 minutes are necessary to begin and improvement will be made as long as you follow your suggestions. Yes, that is exactly correct. I'm glad that that hit home with you, LTB. And that's so true of most things in piano practice. If you're doing it effectively, by nature, you'll be very efficient. And so if you are practicing in an effective way, we can often accomplish a lot in a short amount of time. It's when we start to practice with methods that aren't as effective that we lose that efficiency. And that's when it starts to be like, okay, I sat here for 40 minutes and why do I feel like I didn't accomplish anything? And it's often because we don't know about the most effective ways of doing it. So the things that we talked about today are really effective ways to practice scales. And so exactly as you said, it leads to that efficiency. So you can accomplish a lot in 5 minutes. And you can keep in mind that, scales are something that people literally spend their entire lives practicing. And music in general is something that people spend their entire lives practicing. So there's never any pressure with speed. I mean, obviously, if you're in college as a music major and you have to prepare for a recital, or you're a professional and you have an audition, there are time limits, but we don't in general need to be rushing ourselves through the learning process. And this is such a common thing that I see with adults, is that they want to see huge progress with really short amounts of time. And if we let go of the idea that something has to happen fast, ironically, it usually happens a lot faster because it clears up our mind space to focus on accuracy and to just let ourselves come to the process repeatedly and that will lead to that progress that we want. All right, well, I don't see any other questions in the chat, but thank you all for spending your time with me. If you are enjoying these live streams and loving what you are hearing, check out my website, ashleyjyoung.com/piano member. That's where I have information about the Casual to Confident Piano Player program, which is where we really go in depth with all of this. And I watch you play regularly in group classes and give you these specific bits of information that you need so that you can make small tweaks in your playing. Things that don't take a lot of time, but that can completely elevate the way that you sound and the way that your practice sessions go so that you have that repeated success. Because when we have that repeated success, we want to keep coming back to the piano. Like, we want more and more and more of it. And our brain doesn't care how big the success is. Our brain just cares that we're getting that success often, and that motivates us. And it's hugely empowering and exciting because we start to see that progress happen pretty quickly. All right, everybody, amazing work today. I love spending this time with you, and I can't wait to see you all again next week. Happy practicing, and we will talk soon. Bye.